Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into a hugely influential text in urban studies. That's Henri Lefebvre's The Urban Revolution.
That's right. It originally came out way back in 1970. We're mostly looking at the English version, translated by Robert Bonanno, which also has a foreword by Neil Smith. It's pretty foundational stuff.
Absolutely. And in this deep dive, we're specifically focusing on part 2 of the book. We're going to give these chapters a really thorough look, almost like a detailed book review.
Yeah, because part 1, that really set the stage, didn't it? It introduced the whole concept of the urban moving beyond just the city as a physical thing, stressing its dynamic, maybe even virtual side.
Exactly. So now part 2, it's called The Urban Phenomenon, and it really dives into the substance of urban reality. Lefebvre gets into the levels and dimensions of it all.
And our mission today really is to unpack these chapters for you, to sort of guide you through Lefebvre's thinking here, which can be quite intricate.
It really can. But if you've ever felt that there's more to city life than just concrete and steel, like there are all these complex forces shaping how we live, then part 2 is kind of essential. We're looking beyond the obvious, trying to understand the social, the political, even the philosophical layers. So think of this as our detailed review, chapter by chapter, really laying the groundwork.
And that groundwork is so important because it sets up everything Lefebvre discusses later in part 3 about potential transformations, revolutionary ideas even.
Right, which we will get to in a future deep dive. But first, part 2.
Okay, let's start with chapter 3, the urban phenomenon. This is where Lefebvre makes a really significant shift, doesn't he?
He does. He steps back from just trying to define the city and looks at this broader thing he calls the urban phenomenon. What's the big deal about that shift?
Well, the key thing, I think, is his insistence on analyzing this phenomenon within the context of the real, and he puts that in quotes, which is important. He wants us to look at the processes, the direction things are moving in urban life, not just see it as a static object.
Okay.
And straight away, he points out the sheer scale, the complexity of it all. It's kind of astonishing, he says, because it goes beyond the tools we might have from, say, the natural sciences, which often look for simple cause and effect.
So it's not just about counting buildings or measuring distances. He's saying it's fundamentally a social reality we need to grasp.
Precisely. He argues that older ways of thinking about society, maybe things that worked for, pre-urban times, they just don't cut it for understanding the complex web of social relations in the urban context.
Right.
And this leads him to critique, relying only on scientific analysis. He warns against seeking perfect internal consistency or coherence because, well, that might create a false sense of order.
A false tidiness, almost.
Exactly. It risks missing the inherent disorder, the messiness, the increasing complexity that he sees as fundamental to the urban phenomenon.
So there's a kind of skepticism about a purely detached, objective view, and instead he introduces this idea of the urban as a habitat. What does he mean by habitat here?
For Lefebvre, habitat is really defined by the inhabitants. It's made up of their neighborhoods, the areas they actually live in and shape, the networks they form, the relationships they build.
Okay.
He notes that empirical descriptions, the kind of studies that measure things, often focus on morphology, the physical shape, the layout. And while that's important, he argues it often misses the lived experience, the social stuff that gives it meaning.
It's like looking at a map versus actually walking the streets and talking to people.
That's a great way to put it. The map shows the structure, but not the life within it. And Lefebvre points out how hard it is to get a complete picture, what he calls a totalizing view.
What makes it so difficult?
Several things, really, and they're all connected. First, just the sheer scale and interconnectedness. Everything affects everything else in complicated ways. Second, we always filter things. As observers, we can't take it all in. We select, we interpret based on our own viewpoint.
Makes sense.
And third, he really emphasizes the fragmentation of knowledge because of academic disciplines. Economists look at it one way, geographers another, sociologists another. Each offers a piece, but it's hard to put them all together into one coherent whole.
Which leads him straight to arguing for interdisciplinary approaches, doesn't it? Moving beyond those silos.
Absolutely. He wants cooperation, bringing different lenses together. He even points out the limits of linguistics.
That's interesting. How does language fall short?
Well, he says the urban definitely involves signs and meanings, street signs, building style, social codes, all that. But it's more than just a language system.
How so?
The actual lived experience, the physical practices of daily life, the way space works. These things go beyond what language alone can capture. He talks about urban practice, this idea of a whole societal production.
So it includes signs, yes, but also the unique way space and time feel and function in the city.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about navigating a busy market. It's not just the words spoken, it's the flow of people, the smells, the sounds, the unwritten rules of how you move. That whole experience is urban practice.
I see. It's the doing, the existing within it, not just describing it. But given all this complexity, he admits it's really hard to create a single unified theory, like a science of the urban.
Oh, definitely. The fragmented knowledge we just talked about, plus the difficulty of being truly objective when you're part of the thing you're studying. These are huge hurdles.
Right.
And this leads him to say the urban isn't just a physical thing you can study from the outside. He calls it a virtual object.
A virtual object. What does that mean?
It means it's sociological, it's always becoming, it's constantly being produced and reproduced through social life, through decisions made by leaders, even through chaos and unexpected events. It's never finished.
That really captures the dynamic feeling of cities. And because it's so complex and dynamic, he's pretty skeptical about predicting urban trends easily.
Very skeptical. He argues against simple models that just extend one trend because they ignore all the complex interactions. He also points out how the division of labor, separating, say, academic thinkers from people working on the ground, fragments our understanding even more.
And he even criticizes traditional philosophy for sometimes missing the mark.
Yeah, he feels philosophy often aims for these big, abstract, universal truths and doesn't really get its hands dirty with the specific, messy reality of urban life. It tries to fit the city into existing boxes rather than understanding it on its own terms.
So Chapter 3 basically clears the decks. It shows the limits of old approaches and demands a whole new way of thinking.
That's a good summary. It's a call for a new methodology, a new theory capable of handling the urban phenomenon in all its complexity, contradictions, and constant change.
Quite a challenge. Okay, let's move into Chapter 4 then. Levels and dimensions. This is where he starts giving us some tools to actually do that analysis, right?
Exactly. After showing us just how complex the urban is, now he offers some concepts to help us navigate it. He introduces dimensions and levels to bring some structure to the discussion.
And the first big tool is this idea of 3 levels: global, mixed, and private. Level G, M, and P. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. Level G, that's the global logical and political strategy level. Think biggest picture. Societal power structures, major political decisions, large-scale planning strategies that affect everything, national policies, big international investments, that sort of thing.
Okay, the macro level.
Right. Then there's level P, the private, habiting level. This is the individual's experience.
Okay.
Their home, their immediate surroundings, their daily life and routines within the city, personal space, everyday practices.
The micro level.
And crucially, in between, there's level M, the mixed, mediator, intermediary level. This is the interface, the bridge between G and P. It includes the physical city itself, buildings, streets, infrastructure, but also institutions like local government, community groups, businesses, cultural organizations.
So level M is where the big strategies from G get translated into the reality people experience at P.
Precisely. It mediates between the two. And Lefebvre stresses, this is really important, that these levels are totally interconnected. They constantly influence each other.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A big decision at level G, like a national policy to subsidize mortgages, directly impacts housing choices and affordability for individuals at level P. But also, collective action or changing needs at level P, maybe protests about housing costs, can eventually push for policy changes back up at level G.
And level M is where that interaction often happens: zoning boards, developers, local councils.
Exactly. And Lefebvre warns strongly against analyzing these levels separately. He says you only really understand the urban by looking at how they interact, especially through that mediating level M.
Got it. And within level P, the private level, he talks a lot about habiting. You mentioned it earlier. It sounds like more than just having a roof over your head.
Oh, much more. For Lefebvre, habiting is really rich. It includes the unconscious stuff, the psychological connection we have to our spaces, the emotions, the personal meanings we attach, but also the whole lived experience, routines, interactions, how we actually use and sort of make our immediate environment our own.
So it ties back to his big idea that space isn't just there, it's socially produced.
Absolutely. Our personal experience of habiting at level P is deeply shaped by those broader economic, social, political forces operating at levels G and M.
And using these levels helps show that the urban is multidimensional, right? Not just economic or just social.
Exactly. It has multiple dimensions interacting all the time. There's the physical morphology, the shape and layout. There are the functions, what the city is used for, work, play, etc. And there are the representations, how we think about it, imagine it, symbolize it.
And there are tensions between all these things.
Yes. Inherent tensions and contradictions within levels, between levels, across dimensions. And these tensions, Lefebvre suggests, are actually what drive urban change. They make it dynamic, sometimes chaotic.
It's like a constant push and pull. You mentioned the housing example earlier. How would analyzing something like, say, transportation planning look through these levels?
Okay, transportation. At level G, you'd look at national funding priorities, maybe goals around climate change affecting transport choices, overarching philosophies about public versus private transit.
Big picture strategy.
Right. At level M, you'd see local transit authorities, road construction companies, planning departments deciding on specific bus routes or highway expansions, the physical infrastructure itself.
The implementation and mediation.
Yeah. And at level P, you'd look at individual commute times, the stress of traffic, accessibility for people with disabilities, how easy it is for someone to get to work or see family using the available options, their lived experience of mobility. Understanding the whole system needs you to see how G influences M, which shapes the experience at P, and how P might push back on M and G.
That makes it much clearer how the levels work together. He also notes this isn't static, that the relationship between levels changes over time.
Definitely. History matters. The role of the state, level G, in building infrastructure or housing, level M, has changed dramatically over different eras and in different places.
And he has this concern about homogenization, that planning from the top down can flatten things out.
Yes, he worries that big plans made at level G, often focused on efficiency or grand designs, can ignore the diverse needs and realities of people at level P. This can lead to standardized, impersonal spaces that don't reflect local character or the richness of individual lives.
And this can happen when level M doesn't properly connect P back up to G.
Exactly. Or when powerful interests, maybe related to capital accumulation operating across levels, prioritize profit or control over the lived experience of inhabitants.
Okay, so Chapter 4 gives us this really useful, if complex, analytical toolkit. That brings us to Chapter 5, Urban Myths and Ideologies. The focus shifts here, right? From structure to how we think about cities.
That's right. After laying out the levels and dimensions, Lefebvre turns to the ideas, the beliefs, the often unconscious assumptions, the myths and ideologies that shape how we understand and interact with the urban world.
And he starts, maybe surprisingly, by talking about agrarian myths. Why bring farming into a book about cities?
It is interesting, isn't it? His point is that even though most of us live urban lives now, a lot of our core ideas about things like community, nature, even good governance are still deeply influenced by idealized images of rural agrarian past.
Like a kind of nostalgia.
Sort of. And he argues these lingering myths don't really help us grasp the unique realities of urban life. We might try to apply concepts of tight-knit village community to diverse, sprawling cities, for instance, and then get disappointed or misunderstand how social connections actually work there.
So we might be using the wrong mental map, basically. He also takes aim at the idea of the city being somehow natural.
Yes, he strongly refutes the idea that cities just grow organically, like plants or ecosystems. He insists they are fundamentally social and political creations, shaped by decisions, power, history. Calling them natural, he says, hides the human forces, the economic and political choices that actually build and change them.
Right. It makes it seem inevitable rather than constructed.
Exactly. And then he looks at specific ideologies that have shaped cities, like modernism in planning. Think functional zoning, separating work from home, prioritizing cars.
We definitely see the legacy of those ideas all around us.
We do. And Lefebvre points out that while these ideologies often had rational goals, maybe even utopian ones, they frequently had unintended negative consequences because they imposed abstract ideas onto the complex reality of urban life, often ignoring the people living it.
He also mentions utopias and science fiction. How do they fit in?
He sees them as part of the way we imagine cities, shaping our expectations. Sometimes they offer critiques or inspiration, but they can also distract from or obscure the real-world forces and problems we face.
So imagination is powerful, but it can cut both ways. And just like the levels, these myths aren't fixed either. They change with history.
Absolutely. Historical events profoundly shift how we view cities. Think about the Industrial Revolution. It completely changed the image of the city, adding layers of industry, density, pollution, new kinds of social problems, alongside the older ideas of commerce and culture.
Which really highlights why he thinks it's so important to be aware of the myths and ideologies we carry around.
Critically aware, yes. Because these beliefs, often unexamined, influence everything: our personal actions, the policies we support, the kind of cities we end up building. He also points out that how we even define an urban problem, like crime or traffic, is often shaped by ideology.
And that framing can then limit the solutions we consider.
Precisely. If you frame traffic purely as an individual car problem, you might only think of building more roads, rather than considering public transit investment, which comes from a different ideological starting point.
And finally, he connects these myths back to the levels and dimensions framework.
Yes, he shows how these ideas aren't just abstract thoughts. They operate through the levels. An ideology favoring private homeownership, level P value, drives policies at level G, tax breaks, subsidies, which are implemented via level M, developers building suburbs, shaping the physical and social landscape.
So the ideas have very real material consequences.
Definitely. They shape perception, inform decisions, and are part of the very process of producing urban space.
Wow. Okay, that really brings us through the core of part 2 of the urban revolution. It's been quite a journey. From demanding we look beyond the simple definition of city to giving us the tools of levels and dimensions and then making us examine the myths and ideologies we hold.
It really has. Part 2 provides that rigorous analytical base. We've seen the shift to the broader urban phenomena, the need for interdisciplinary views, the GMP levels framework, the multiple dimensions, and the crucial role of those underlying myths and ideologies. It's dense, but foundational.
Absolutely foundational. And it's all leading somewhere because, as we mentioned, our next deep dive will tackle part 3. That's where Lefebvre really starts to build on this analysis to explore, well, possibilities for transformation.
Right. He moves towards strategies for change, his vision for a different kind of urban future, the revolutionary potential he sees within the city itself. It builds directly on everything we've discussed today.
So, perhaps a final thought for you, listening. As you go about your day, maybe start noticing these things in your own town or city. Think about those levels, the big policies, G, the local institutions and physical stuff, M, your own daily experience, PO. How do they connect?
Yeah, and what are the dimensions at play? The physical shape, the functions, the way it's represented or talked about.
Yep.
Maybe try to spot some of those underlying myths or ideologies. What assumptions are shaping your understanding of your urban environment and its future? What forces are really at work? It gives you a lot to think about.
It certainly does. We hope you'll join us next time as we continue this exploration into part 3 of Lefebvre's The Urban Revolution.